Let's start with our last session of this conference. And I see literary researchers here on the list. Dear colleagues from Estonia. And our first speaker is Marin Laak from Estonia Literary Museum, and she will talk Love and Landscape, Estonian exile poet Gunnar Neeme in Australia. Please.
Nüüd lülitab ümber. Üks. Good morning, dear colleagues. I shall examine here the literary works of the Australian-Estonian artist and writer Gunnar Neeme. And I shall ask a question today about the poetics and semantics of Neeme's poetry in the context of the wider landscape of Estonian exile literature. And I use here the term exile, pagulaskirjandus. Considering Neeme's literary heritage, we could ask whether and how we can examine his works as a part of the Estonian literary field. After World War II, 3 generations of Estonian writers have active in exile. Firstly, the already established authors who had started their careers in pre-war Estonia. Secondly, the authors who made their debut during the war. And thirdly, finally, the authors who were still children during the war. Gunnar Neeme as a writer was a great exception because he did not belong to any of these generations. He made his debut as a writer unusually late during the second half of the 1960s, when he was almost 50 years old. And some additional words about his life. At the end of 1930s, Gunnar Neeme studied art at the famous Pallas Art School in Tartu. Like thousands of Estonians, he escaped from the homeland with his family in September 1944. In DP camp in Germany, he continued his studies and started teaching art. Starting from 1949, Melbourne became Neeme's new home. There he taught art at the local art societies and gave private art lessons. He was a member of the Victorian Art Societies, the Malvern Artists Society, and the Association of Sculptors of Victoria. He held a lot of one-man art exhibitions, participated in group exhibitions in Australia, and represented Australian art overseas, in Canada, in USA, even in Japan. Neeme's name was wrapped in silence in Estonia in 2003. When information about the manuscript of the New English translation of the Estonian national epic, the Kalevipoeg, in Melbourne, reached in the Estonian media. This manuscript by Triinu Kartus was published with 80 Gunnar Neeme's original illustrations by the Estonian Literary Museum in 2011. Starting from 1966, Neeme had made more than 200 drawings on Kalevipoeg. In 1990, Neeme gave the copies of these collections of drawings to the Kreutzwald Memorial Museum in Võru, Estonia. And the original of this series, together with paintings and manuscripts, arrived in the Estonian Literary Museum from Melbourne last year. And some of them can be seen at our new exhibition opened yesterday. Gunnar Neeme's archive shows that he had tried his hand at almost every literary genre, from drama and essays to criticism. The literary presentations and recitations of poetry were often included in Neeme's exhibition openings in Australia. Neeme has published 4 collections of poetry, 3 theatre plays, essays and criticism, and his archive contains an unpublished manuscript of short stories. His kaleidoscopic range of works and his versatile activities in the field of visual arts were still not quite sufficient for its overflowing talent. Literature and books written in Estonian have played an important role in maintaining the national identity in exile. The Estonian Writers' Union in Exile was created in Sweden already 1945. 2 publishing houses, the Estonian Writers' Cooperative in Sweden and Orto in Canada, and 2 literary quarterly magazines were established in the 1950s for publishing original fiction, poetry and literary reviews in Estonian language. There were 3 main centers of Estonian literary activities in the West, as we know, Sweden, Canada and New York. Due to both the geographic distance and its character, Australian Estonian literature has never received as much attention as the rest of Estonian exile literature. Only one overview about Estonian literature in Australia was published in the magazine Mana in 1968. Gunnar Neeme's name was mentioned in it, although by that time he had published only a few poems in the Estonian exile and Finnish periodicals. Among them were 5 longer texts in the Tulimuld, the central and prestigious literary magazine Estonian exile literature. As a writer, Neeme gained more recognition with his plays Fern Flower, Sõna ja lõis, and The Land of Black Crosses, Mustade ristide maa, which depicted the Estonian folklore and history and were performed at the 5th Estonian Days in Adelaide and also at the legendary Esto 88 in Melbourne. The play Mosaigid was more intimate and examined the essence of human character. Neeme's plays have not been never published. Having read his first experiments, several literary critics stated that Neeme was a true literary talent. His main form of self-expression is prose poetry, the strong individuality of which lies in the fact that it uses philosophical allegory. Neeme published his first collection of poems, Yellow Rain, Paintings of Sight and Understanding in year 1976, so 10 years after his debut in Tulimund. Altogether, as I said before, Neeme has published 5 books of fiction, 2 in Estonian and 3 in English. The first collection of poems was followed by Mist of Time, Meditations in Words and Pictures, written in English and published in 1976. Then 5 years later, the second collection of prose poems in Estonian, Maalid tuiman, Painted Earrings, reflections of observations and variations, and collection in English, the notes essays in verse and pictures were published in 1981. In his last work of fiction, a collection of poems in English, The Waves, Observations and Impressions, was published in 1988. All of these books are unique and complete works. The collections written in English tend to include more abstract and philosophical contemplative poetry. And all 5 collections were designed by Gunnar Neeme himself. They are beautiful books printed in snow-white coated paper and illustrated by the author. Each prose poem is accompanied by unique translation to the visual art format. His text, verbal and visual shapes are inseparable and in harmony with each other, forming powerful images. In his search for new forms of expression, Neeme took the boldest step in his books titled The Notes. This book consists of 5 longer essay poems, all reflecting the author's quite deep interest in Oriental philosophy. This interest is revealed in the title of the first text, Notes to Tao Tsang. The texts are accompanied by monotypes on 23 separate sheets. Gunnar Neeme's poetic imaginary is often based on the simple and prosaic things. These could easily be seen as still lifes, verbal pictures of harmonious moments. However, more often, the author tried to catch and convey the existential beauty of the internal flow of the life through the still life as a meta-image. A painted earring, unreachable, magical. And all the examples of Neeme's poetry are translated by Tiina Kers here in my slides. Even a brief glance at Neeme's Estonian books of poetry confirms that his huge talent in the visual arts was matched by that in his literary work. As in visual arts, in his paintings of different experimental techniques, he experimented with various forms, styles and topics in his literary text as well. Colorful and at the same time symbolic landscapes, for example, are intertwined with almost surreal searches for forms, and the author's vivid linguistic intuition and inventive language seem surprising in the context of Estonian exile poetry. Neeme's literary works are characterized by lexical richness. He sometimes managed to create pictures which seems almost to move and caught in reader's eye. Here is the example of the poem on the stands of foam, Koduliival. This randomly selected piece of poetry also reveals an essential topic in Gunnar Neeme's poetry, pictures of his homeland. Nostalgia for his homeland is found in recollections of the beautiful nature of his native country, as is common in the Estonian exile literature. Gunnar Neeme took the images of homeland to extremes and reached an image of an ancient landscape. In this slide, in this slide in an example from the poem Painted Earring, Maalit hõllandus. In Estonian exile culture, through generations, there is a strong tradition of depicting native Estonia as an ancient wonderland. But Neeme adds to this image his own magic dimension of the past. It reminds us of the artist's graphic works for Kalevipoeg based on the central image of a mythological landscape. Ancient landscapes, and through them the national spirit, carried a wider meaning for Neeme. They are connected with the obligation to remember. We have to forget in order to live, because actually we live in order to forget. Thinking about the tragic fate of his nation, he has written numerous poems, short stories, and essays. For instance, one of the most important issues for him was the role of individual during the great history events during the war. In Estonian exile literature, so-called soldiers' poetry, soldiers' literature clearly stand out. The most widely known and translated works in this field were written by Arvel Viirlaid, the Australian prose writer, lived in Canada. We know from Neeme's handwritten biographies that he had seen the horrors of the battlefield and faced death several times. These moments are unforgettable. And his soldiers' poetry, in his soldiers' poetry and short stories, Gunnar Neeme describes such moments as well as harrowing loss of his brother-in-arms with striking clarity. The human suffering and pain in Neeme's war poems form a constant comparison of the fate of brother-in-arms and the question of the value or meaninglessness of human life. Here is an example. Here is an example of the poem Letter to a Fallen Brother-in-Arms. Here is mistake, I'm sorry. A brother in arms. I had a two parallel translation of this. Relvavend. A sad recollection of companion who died in a battle had been developed into a letter to the world and then ends with a painful statement. If we forget the warriors and if there is no people, the soul goes missing. Besides the painful recollections of the war, the topic of exile stand out in the Gunnar Neeme's poetry. The magic ancient picture of the nature of his homeland is sometimes mixed with reflections of being a refugee. In one of the most memorable poems, In Exile or A Refugee in Exile, pagulane paguluses in Estonian, the poet plays with the word refugee and exiles, refining the nuances of these words. The exile hesitates between singular and plural because they can only come together in the memory of the fear. Neeme seemed to be in permanent inner dialogue with the state of being in exile, even with the essence of exile itself. He often enrobed his contemplations of fatherland in pictures of nature full of the plants and colors. One of his favorite motifs in his poems is snow. Snow is represented by various word paintings, and as in the poem in Forbidden Peace, Tabulisen rahun. Winter seems to mean internal peace, silence in the white landscape which expands into be starry sky. Wide fields of snow, winter silence, and also summer landscapes rich in nature are not uncommon in Estonian exile poetry. But to understand Gunnar Neeme's poems, we need to keep in mind the location where they were created. The landscape in Australia under the Southern Cross is mostly a hot desert, and any image of snow is exotic. A contrast to the snow fields of his homeland, we recognized in Neeme's poems some of the nature of his new host country, Australia. For example, here is the poem Yarravonga, where eucalyptus trees, silver drains into the simple ripple of the wave. The monotonous timelessness of Australian landscapes forms a deep contrast with his powerful pictures of the homeland. Being an artist is undoubtedly essential for Gunnar Neeme as a poet. His most passionate texts are dedicated to painting. They contain no irony and paradoxes, nor states of loneliness and sadness, which are generally very characteristic for him. Neeme's poems about colors are almost ecstatic. As an artist, Neeme thought that colors express the human soul, shades of feelings, and even peace. The author's task was just to find the colors. The breath and life of colors is everywhere. There is, and finally, conclude my long paper. There is an interesting paradox. There is an interesting paradox in Gunnar Neeme's creative life for me. One of the main themes of his poetry is painting and colors, but at the same time, painting and colors were not sufficient for Gunnar Neeme's creative spirit to convey everything. His poems are complete for word pictures, and he worked with words like an artist who paints a picture, adding colors, mix them, converting in the initial images with new layers. It's difficult to highlight single lines of his poem. However, Gunnar Neeme's rich handwritten heritage shows him as an active writer We can notice careful elaboration of verses and lines of thought, experimental modeling of words and rhythms. It could even be said that the artists taught and experienced the world through writing. That the artist taught and experienced the world through writing. In the beginning of my paper, I asked whether Gunnar Neeme's works belong to the Estonian literary field. Neeme is, without any doubt, a great, original and distinctive author. Why then are his works not included into the Estonian literary historiography? The only possible reason could be the lack of the possibilities to disseminate his works, and the works of other Australian Estonian authors outside the continent, especially to the larger centers of the Estonian diaspora in the West, Sweden, Canada, and USA. This was the main reason why the literature in Australia could not participate in the life of Estonian exile literary networks. Estonian literature in Australia was left outside the classical communication circle of literature. There, in Australia, were too few recipients, readers, and reviewers. But literary criticism is the key element in living literary circle. Did Gunnar Neeme want to reach the Parnassus of Estonian exile literature? Probably not, because he was a giant in the field of visual arts. Neeme published his poetry books mostly by himself and for himself, carried by love to the word and the world. But I'm sure that the best works of Neeme's literary oeuvre, his contemplative poems about the fate of his homeland, about exile, nature, and art, and its meditative poems about loneliness, love and friendship, happiness, hope, truth, beauty, and goodness demonstrate that we can find even more hidden treasures in Australian Estonian literature that will enrich Estonian literature as a whole. Thank you.
Yeah. Do anyone has questions? Anne?
To me, yellow rain is a metaphor for the fallout from atomic bomb testing in the 1950s and 1960s. So I'm wondering, do you know what yellow rain meant to Gunnar Neeme?
I don't know, because in Estonian poetry and here I was very young during these years. We didn't have this kind of meaning. It's very interesting. Thank you. But it's metaphor, yellow rain. It's well known in Australia.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
Around the world.
English, but this is a context that we don't know. Mm-hmm.
I have a question to you. Are there any plans to publish or republish Gunnar Neeme's literary works? in Estonia.
Yes, I have somewhere here, and I maybe next year I try to find some support or foundations, and I have this on my mind because this is a really good poetry, yeah, and nobody knows.
Good. If there are no other questions, oh, there's one.
Thank you, Marin. I wanted to ask, you said Gunnar Neeme's poetry was published also in Tulimuld, or how much of it was published and known?
Only a poem, nägemisest ja mõistmisest, yeah, only one poem, okay. Yeah, but quite a long poem. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But there are some author from Australia, only some author from Australia published in Tulimuld. Yeah. Three altogether.
Again, thank you so very much and good luck with publishing Gunnar Neeme's written heritage. So, our next speaker deals the same questions, poetry, Estonian poetry in exile. And Anneli Mihkelev's paper's title is Wind Over the Sea, Diaspora-Homeland Relations in Estonian Poetry.
Thank you very much and hello everyone. I am from Tallinn University. Now it's good. I am from Tallinn University and Baltic literature and especially exile literature is one of my research topic already quite a long time. The title of my paper is borrowed from a poem by Gustav Suits today. Gustav Suits was a great Estonian poet and he was also our first literary professor in Tartu University before Second World War. He lived in several times in Finland and Sweden, sometimes in exile. He studied in Finland when he was a young man, but after that there were political reasons why he lived in exile. Tiina Kirss has written in her article Branches of the Cleft Oak, Homeland Diaspora Literary Relations in Estonia in 1998. That's the most famous descriptions of uniting this diaspora and homeland literatures of Estonia is Jaan Kross' image of the cleft oak tree. I think that there are also several other motives and metaphors and symbols which unite the diaspora and homeland in Estonian poetry. The title Wind from Over the Sea is taken from the last poetry book Tuli and Tuul, Fire and Wind from 1950 by Gustav Suits, and it was published in Sweden when the poet was in exile. Suits' last collection of poems contains the poet's memories of the tragic history of his country and of his own past. And if you see the other collection of the poetry books, there's only one collection of poetry by Gustav Suits published in Estonia. It was a collection Kõik on kokku unenägu, All is but a dream, from 1922, what was published in Tartu. The others are published in Helsinki. There were Elu tuli, The Fire of Life from 1905, Tuulemaa, The Land of Winds from 1913, and the last one, Tuli ja Tuul, Fire and Wind from 1950 in Stockholm. Herbert Salu, who is a literary critic in exile, has written that a remarkable poem from the last Suits collection is Tuul üle mere, Wind from over the sea. Although Salu has also had opinion that the last collection of Suits' poetry was tragic. Suits wrote about his memories of his homeland, which the wind brought to him from over the sea, although the wind served a powerful symbol in the homeland too. Suit's second collection, The Land of Winds, and later younger generations poets, for example, Betty Alver, and also others. Today I like to speak also a little bit Betty Alver's poems. And if you think about our Lydia Koidula, she also used a symbol of wind if she was in Gronlin. But Koidula wrote about morning wind, which is fresh and also brought the news from her homeland. When Suit's last poetry book was published in Sweden, it was a remarkable event in exile society and became an important event for exile literary researchers, but the reception in the homeland was quite reserved. The Estonian translator and researcher Ants Soras was also lived in exile in Sweden, England and USA, wrote that Suits was a very talented and inspiring poet who influenced several younger poets. Oras himself played an important role in 1938 when he compiled an anthology of a new generation of Estonian poets entitled Arvujad, in English Conjurers or Soothsayers. There were 8 poets who belonged to the Arvujad group, although it was not possible to imitate Suit's poetry because he had a very original style. Suits was a model who helped poets to create and develop their own style. Ants Soras believes that poets who were great imitators of Suits were also our greatest poets. Visnapuu, Under, Talvik, Alver, Bernard Kangro, et al. It means the great poets, they didn't imitate Suits' poetry and Suits himself, but they imitate the working style of Suits, or imitate how to write the poems or literary works. Visnapuu, Bernard Kangro et al., they belong to the Arvujad group, but Suits helped them to their own original styles. Alver, Talvik and Kangro belonged to the Arvujad group. Visnapuu was the best-known Estonian poet besides Suits and Under to make his way from Estonia to the West. He wrote both decadent erotic lyrics and powerful patriotic poems. His poems and ballads were based on historical events, legends and Christian motives. Visnapuu, more purely lyrical even than Under, was a wizard of verbal melody, buoyant, cynical and moving, as well as being highly experimental. He often got away with seemingly impossible things in his early verse. The last poetry book by Gustav Suits, Fire and Wind, contains absolutely new poetry, which is vital, genuine and bitter at the same time, according to Ants Soras. There are several very good poems about exile and diaspora in Suits' last collection. For example, I have some examples here also on the slides. Tund säärane, this is a Haue, or Silmast silma, from eye to eye, etc. It seems the message of these poems are not only for diaspora literature, but also for the homeland. His last volume of verse, Fire and Wind, from 1950, published 6 years before his death in Stockholm, shows all of his mastery, as well as a new mellowness of attitude, a keen sympathy for his fellow expatriates, and a more gentle and subtle humanity, according to Anne Lange. And if you see that the poem From Eye to Eye, Silmast silma, the verses are quite the same as Ants Soras written. They are really genuine, vital, very expressive, and a little bit bitter at the same time. And it seems to me that the message of the poem is not really only for the diaspora people, but it sounds like a poem to our contemporary time, to our contemporary society. Especially it's an exception only the beginning and the end of the poem. The end of the poem, two last strophes, you raise your eye, you meet an eye, it finds you, unknown, yet known, a common knowledge spins you, the expatriates compatriotism of pain. Look hard at other eyes. No one sees his own, life seals can be unsealed, its hidden knowledge known. Another one is a very good poem, The Bird, Sõna. The last strophe, it's very expressive. And also, it's a little bit bitter, but it doesn't dominate. I see it's a little bit also hopeful. It lives from mouth to mouth. We guard our band and banished word. The buried fire must smolder, unshocked, unmuted, to faint heart beats bolder and bolder, rise and ring, my bird from land to land. It's very strong poet and very strong emotions at the same time. Little bit bitter, but it doesn't dominate. The knowledge given events striking at the very root of the existence is now realized by him in a way in heart never been before. His real witness is reserved for the forces of active evil, yet he sees indestructible hope in the growing generation. For example, in the poem Kevad, noorus, spring, joos, Suit's command of language, rhyme, rhythm, and compelling sound heard, if anything increase, so had his belief of the force of the word in this poem. Much of this verse is unmistakably major poetry, immediate of its impact, but evoking long echoes. Suits wrote this in the poem Kevad, noorus, what I mentioned before, spring, joos, such kind of lines. Yours laughs even in hell, even if the blue vault showed fall to splinters. That is really something new in the context of Suit's poetry. It seems that several poems from the collection Fire and Wind also reflect the innovations which took place in the exile poetry in the 1940s after the publication of Ilmar Laavan's book Ankruketi lõpp on laulu algus. The end of the anchor chain is the beginning of song from 1946. That was one of the most innovative poetry books in Estonian literature, and it has a very strong influence since its surrealistic freedom liberated poetic language and metaphor. Laavan was a versatile man of letters whose nature is that of a restless pioneer seeking ways as remote as possible from the golden mean. Laavan is uncompromisingly avant-garde by temperament, according to Oras and Kangro. The next and even bigger step after Ilmar Laavan was taken by Kalju Lepik, who, reducing the abundant parallelism and alliterative arabesques of his motives, irreverently achieves musical pregnancy of expression. His best poems are short, seldom exceeding 10 or 12 lines, almost Japanese haikus in Estonian dress, if often more robust. Lepik is the most consistent cultivator of a purely lyrical style in the Estonian poetry today, as written Ants Oras. According to Ants Oras, such younger poets as Grünthal, Arno Vihalem, and Kalju Lepik appear to have learned something from surrealism and its later ramifications for varying degrees and almost in their own fashion. It seems that all of these poets also learned from Gustav Suits how to be original and how to create their own styles. This innovation was predicted by Lepik's second collection, Mängumees, the musician from 1948, in which the author showed an interest in an obscure idea of Hades or hell It's a poetic expression of the spirit of a nation without homeland. And I have an example. It's in Estonian language. It's not translated. The title is Delirium. And I can say that it's about poetic ego who plays a card with devil. And the devil lost all things, not only money, but also the hell, the place where the devil is a master. The last verse, it's like mu päralt nüüd on põrgu in Estonian, but it's all the hell is mine now. That is a grotesque image a little bit, but it's express the feeling people without the homeland. So it's understandable that Kalju Lepik wrote in the newspaper Eesti Teataja in 1951 an exhaustive and very positive review of Suit's last poetry book. Lepik wrote that Suits represented 3 different styles in his poetry. The first was the style of the fire of life, the second was that of the land of winds, and the third was that of all is but a dream. Fire and wind was the key to all of Suit's poetry because all of their styles were combined in this last collection. Kalju Lepik believes that Suit's last poetry book was a masterpiece of Estonian literature. Suit's poems are not surreal and robust, but his poetry contains irony and wordplay, and even parody or earlier text. For example, in the poem Kas tunned maad, do you know that land, what's the meaning? Something like, do you not know that land, which is a very famous song in our song festivals. But in Gustav Suit's poem, we see it's a parody and irony. It means Suit's poems contain laughter through tears, which can be a grotesque image. That is a new thing in the last poetry book. But if we consider the books on Estonian literature published in the homeland, the texts are quite short and laconic. For example, the book Eesti kirjanduslugu, Estonian Literary History of 2001, deals mainly with Suit's 3 collections of poetry published before 1944. But there's only one paragraph about his last collection stating that there was nothing new in Suit's last poetry book. That is continued the same style as in the early collections, and that it was important in exile, but that the most important collections were still The Land of Winds, All is but a Dream, and The Fire of Life. A similar opinion is evident in the book Eesti kirjandus paguluses, Estonian exile literature from 2008, although the individuality of Suit's poetry in the last period is mentioned. It's interesting that the reception of Suit's exile poetry has been so reserved, interpreted in the particular way and sometimes dominated by misunderstanding or prejudice. Usually critics in Estonia have just written that Suits was disappointed and bitter, and that his rebellious soul had settled down. Exile researchers are different opinions. Suits used several symbols in his exile poetry, and it's possible to analyze the dynamics of the symbols. Jüri Lotmas has stated that the symbol contains something archaic, but also contains a new textual context. It comes from the past and passes on into the future. Perhaps that is the most important aspect of the essence and the dynamics of the literary symbol. Ants Oras wrote about the symbol of wind in a European context, and he compares poems by Gustav Suits and Percy Shelley, British famous poet. Shelley's famous poem, Ode to the West Wind. And Oras also stated that there's a intertextual connection between these 2 poems, but the emotions are totally different. because Shelley's poem is about west wind, which is warmer, and quicker, moving more, and hopeful. But Sweet's poem is about autumn time. It's depressive after the revolution, and it's not so optimistic. The emotions are totally different, and of course, Shelley's poem it's a experimental poem because Shelley plays with sonnet style. Actually, it's a ode to the west wind. It's not a sonnet, but he imitated that. Ivar Ivask wrote about Ivar Ivask with Škola and Aja spoke about him in the morning. He wrote about continuity in Estonian literature, and he stressed the wind as a symbol connected with the homeland of Estonia. Ivask wrote about Betty Alver, who was not an exile poet but remained in the homeland. Alver used the symbol of wind in several literary works. The first novel, Tuule armuke, The Wind's Paramour from 1927. It was a novel, not a poem. And first collection of poetry, Tolm and Tuli, Tolm ja tuli, Dust and Fire, from 1936, demonstrated the author's independence and artistic maturity and make her renowned writer in Estonia. In 1970, she wrote the poem Tuulelapsed, Children of the Wind, included in the collection Elu helbed, Flakes of Life. It was published in 1971. Ivar Ivask wrote that Alver's poem alludes to Gustav Suit's second collection, The Land of Winds, which appeared in 1913 in Helsinki. Ivask connected two poetry books by Gustav Suits, the third and the last, because Suits was in exile when both books appeared. Ivask interpreted Suits' poem and symbol of the wind as carrying messages of the homeland. The Land of Winds represented Estonia in Suits' second collection of poetry, because the Land of Winds is a symbol of Estonia, or Maarjamaa, Land of Mary. In this poem, Alver referred to the great Estonian poets, several, Juhan Liiv, Gustav Suits, Maria Under, and August Kirchberg. And she united historical events which had influenced Estonian history with well-known places. History had cast a dark and gloomy shadow over our people. And I have an example, it's the last part of the poem, Tuulelapsed, Children of the Wind. It's the last two strophes. It's in Estonian, but I can speak about a little bit what about the poem is. The Children of Winds symbolizes young people who know nothing about tragic history and nothing about the dark shadow history. The Children of the Winds are free to fly wherever they want. It's the first line in this poem. Lennake läbi kõik mandrid, las jääb maha leplik legend, and so on. Different places all over the world await them. Ivar Ivask analyzed Alver's poem in his article, and he believes that Alver's poem was great and united all Estonians, both in the homeland and in exile. It's significant that Alver's poem was written in the Soviet time. This means that it was only a dream to fly all over the world. Ivask wrote this article in 1978, and it was the first published in the journal Mano. It was an exile journal. And in this article, Ivask also quoted all the poem, but it was not translated into English. The English translation also made by Ivar Ivask was published in Selected Poems by Betty Alver, which was published in 1989 in Toronto. And there were several translators who have translated Betty Alver's poetry. Taimi Ene-Maks, Willis Brownstone, Felix Oinas, Billy Collins, Mardi Valgemäe, Elmar Maripuu, Talvi Laev, Ivar Ivask, Bernard Lionel Enbond. And Ivask was translated, I don't know, perhaps it was his favorite poem about the land of children of wind. But it was in this collection in English. Ivask was a poet and scholar who wrote about exile literature and also literature written in the homeland. Betty Alver was not the only poet from the homeland who interested Ivask. He was interested especially in writers in the 1960s. Paul-Erik Rummo, August Sang, Jaan Kaplinski, Jaan Kross, Enn Vetemaa and Mati Unt. And the Betty Alver, that poem is a really great text because what we find that the children must fly all over the world. And the last strophe is there's a book, a stony book, made stone, and it's on the cover is the title De Gigantibus. And there is several intertextual allusions. If you see that the words, international symbols, and also moose, for example, tarantel, dragon, salamander, scorpion. It's international words which is so many connotations. Homunculus, horror and terror, and also the waiting. And Alver also allude to the Bible in this poem. But the last lines is very impressive. I can't read that book, but there is one paragraph in this book. I hope that you can read it, and you find there's only one, is a list of the great people and great places, and I hope that is one paragraph with the title Estonia. It's the last line and last verse of this poem. And conclusion from me. Novel cultural development and context were destroyed during the Soviet occupation. Although the Iron Curtain had fallen between the West and East, literature and culture developed on both sides. It's interesting how ideas and literary and national symbols survived in exile in literary works and in the memories of refugees. Exile literature developed in the free world, and it was innovative in several ways. It was remarkable that all of these innovations in exile literature also influenced literature in the homeland. I think first was innovations in exile, and then homeland also continued. Also, the Iron Curtain was strong. The contacts between the diaspora and homeland still existed. The wind from over the sea brought news from the land of winds to those in exile and vice versa. Thank you.
Do we have questions to Anneli?
My question is about, are there any Estonian exile literates in Germany? This morning we heard about exile literature from, I think, North America, Australia, etc. I was just wondering, was there nothing in Europe, in Germany, for example, or in Great Britain, where also Estonians lived? Thank you.
In Germany, I think yes, they are, but I don't remember their names. But yes, I mean, sometimes I think at least in Germany, I must think.
Elin Doona was living in Great Britain, right? And Gert Helbem also for at least some time, I think. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, so lots of thanks to Anneli for a paper. And we have our very last paper of this conference about the beginnings and new beginnings. And the title fits very well with the ending of the conference because Tiina Kirs will talk about the endings, discourse of life writing and the 1944 Estonian diaspora.
Thank you. I have no slides, maybe just to be different. But a cycle of slides does exist, so for those who are interested, you can email me and I will send you some. What I want to reflect on today, and I should say at the outset where I'm coming from, I'm a literary scholar, a comparative literature scholar, but my second passion has been life writing, and particularly life writing in the Estonian diaspora. And I am the child of two refugees who fled Estonia in 1944, not knowing each other yet at the time, and who ended up in the USA, where I was born. And for the last 12, 13 years, I've been living in Estonia, living and working here. And what I'd like to talk about under the title of endings, first I'd like to correct my title in the sense that I'm sorry the word discourse is spelled wrong. I didn't do that myself, I hope. And I don't plan to use the word discourse in the rigorous Foucaultian sense, but merely as a term meaning the ways of talking, ways of considering phenomena that are perhaps a little bit more solidified than individual or even small group utterances. And what I'd like to reflect on, indeed, under the title of endings, is some of the modalities of eliciting life writing, particularly from the generation of people, and this really is a fractured generation. It ranges from people born in the 1920s, who by now have largely passed, to people born in the late 1930s who were small children during the process of becoming refugees, and the subsequent resettlement in second or even third places after the war. And the two aspects that I've been connected with in my recent work, and also dating now frighteningly far back, is the phenomenon, the modality of collecting life stories through collection campaigns by memory institutions. And the most recent articulation of that is what we call the fourth volume of a large collection of Estonian life stories called Eesti Rahva Elulood, Estonian Life Stories. First volumes of this book, this project, were published in the year 2000, followed by a third volume in 2002, and now, in time for the birthday, this 100th birthday of the Estonian Republic, a very ambitious two-volume collection of life stories under the subtitle Minu elu ja armastus, My Life and Love, a quotation from a famous Estonian author, Anton Hansen Tammsaare. And the campaign way of collecting life stories relies on sending out a call, publishing it in various places in the mass media, and relying very strongly on mediators and encouragers, such as the heads of archives, such as Piret Norhaini in this case, who was very active in eliciting life stories from people in the diaspora and asking them to sit down and actually write, not just talk about writing or not just write down fragments. And the process of producing this kind of volume then collects the stories by a certain deadline, and then they are juried. And a group of people, usually connected with life writing also through their research in various memory institutions, this very museum we're sitting in now, as well as the Estonian Literary Museum, and a few other kinds of research groups from the university. And then the stories are read. And some of them are 20, 25, even many more pages, and others are short accounts. And the jurying process is not quantitative. It is a result of qualitative reading, exchanging of ideas, exchanging of opinions about the stories, and then finally a kind of selecting, a weeding out of those that will then be awarded and published. And you can already see that there are various problems with this, various theoretical and methodological problems, and they are basically about, well, what constitutes an awardable life story, a worthy life story. And I can't answer that question in great detail. It really requires many articles, and I have published some of them. But the well-told story, the story that has been put together of details that are well described, a plot that is discernible, and other kinds of connections, perhaps the very rareness of the person's background. They didn't have a very typical trajectory in their lives, be it post-war in Estonia or in exile or in Siberian deportation. So there is a bias toward the well-told story, a person who has some idea of the craft of writing. But the other side of the question about the adequacy of these stories is, of course, the connection with factual, remembered detail. And there are mistakes that people make. They don't check their facts. And so there's the other really difficult issue, in addition to the fact that, well, we're biased toward well-told stories, is that if somebody slips on a detail, how can we trust that their account is in fact valid from a historical perspective, to form part of this canonical constitution of stories? This whole process then moves on to editing, because the book is 1,000 pages long. Out of 200 stories collected, there are 67 stories that have been included in the book. And I was part of the group that had to help edit the stories in the company of Ruth Hinrichs and a few other people at the Estonian Literary Museum, for whom editing life stories had been a practice that they had used before. It made me very uncomfortable at times, because the story that was constructed in the editing process was quite far away from the kind of uneven, sometimes fragmentary, unpolished nature of the original story. But that, again, is answered by my colleagues, and I'd say it's an okay answer, it's not a great answer, is, well, if anybody really wants to read the real story, then they can come to the museum, and they can go to the archive, and they can have it brought out to them so they can read and compare. Well, to me, some of these comparisons are quite disturbing. So the putting together of a volume of life stories that is a celebration of Estonian Republic 100th anniversary is in itself a project that then requires many different kinds of foreshortenings and many kinds of shortcuts, I would say. And from the time that the campaign collection call was published in various places, the people who constituted the board, the jury, and the sponsors in the memory institutions knew that this was the last one. This was the last collection of Estonian life stories under that title. And so that represents a culmination and also a sense that now with the 4 volumes together, for better or for worse, there is a closed canon. This doesn't mean that the collection of life stories is not going to happen anymore. It's just that in this particular form and format, it is now, in a sense, locked. And so researchers who begin to ask questions of this canon can begin to do so with a certain kind of determination. And I think that research needs to be done. It's not enough for these books quite expensive books, to be disseminated and present in bookstores and present in museums for sale. But there is a sense that this is the locking in of the canon. And it is interesting to watch how the dominant topics of the stories, as well as the birth years, have shifted. And in this 4th volume, there were 12 stories by Estonians who had fled to the West in 1944. Only one of them was the story of someone from the generation of the 1920s, who was born in the 1920s. The others were all stories of those who remembered the refugee journey as children, that is, who drew upon the memories of adults at the time to frame their own retrospective account of what it was like to, first of all, to flee, the danger that was involved, then the stopovers in DP camps, and then after that, the drive or the necessity of resettling somewhere else. And there was also the sense, mention these two together, that the Siberian stories were much less significant in terms of the whole. There were fewer of them, and they were also stories of children who had remembered a chapter of their childhood. These were no longer those who were deported as adults in 1941. That cohort of people has passed on for the most part. Or, and I add the caveat, there are people who will never write. They will never tell their life stories. Not necessarily because there are any skeletons in their closet, anything particular to hide, but retelling means reliving on some level, and there's courage in the decision not to remember, not to go through the process of creating a narrative, even if there's a very strong positive discourse around giving your story on, passing it on to the next generation, making sure it's not lost. The decision not to remember in narrative is a courageous one. So the Estonian Life Stories project belies, I think, some imperatives, some myths that I found myself thinking about increasingly since I was part of the project more intensively than in the previous ones. And these are kinds of assumptions in collecting life story material, actually being in the process of collecting, that is, interviewing or recommending that people write, or reading what they have written and giving them feedback. And I think it's a kind of series of imperatives that people who study memory tend to agree with. And the first is that elicitation is willing. Elicitation of a story is a willing process. It is a process that people are delighted to do because they feel that it's important to pass on their legacy, and that it is a process that people engage in with willingness. The second is based on Evie Domingo's talk yesterday, the assumption that all photos are ultimately legible. If we just do the work, if we describe them, that the photos are legible, they are available, they are material that is consequent to studying the past. The third is that transmission is endless and effective. And that means the assumption that there is communicative memory, that is, there is the social circumstances, either in families or in groups, societies, small organizations, that make it their priority to transmit stories about the past, especially stories about those moments and those events that had far-reaching significance for a group of people. And that this transmission, no, not effortless, but endless, and that it works. And I think most people who work on life story material realize this is not so. Transmission is fragmentary, transmission is faulty, transmission is incomplete, and often unwilling. And finally, the fourth assumption is that when you preserve a life story, it is safe. And this is founded more on what the Osmans have theorized as cultural memory, that is, the sedimentation in an archive of collected material, however diverse, however fragmentary, if it's in a house of memory, if it's in an institution of memory, it's safe because it's preserved. And what this belies is the locking in of codes. That is, if I take the first volume of Tulimuld, for example, just to give an example relevant to some of the literary talks today, the first volume of a literary magazine published in the late 1940s in the Swedish-Estonian community, then as a literary scholar, I have to warn myself not to make the assumption that I can understand those texts, that I can make sense of the code, the imperatives, the ideas, the priorities, and that those are transparent to me. No, they're not. And many of them, even with good search motors so you can see how frequently a term exists and can be found in various kinds of texts, that's not a fail-safe way to be able to read the code of the past. And the same is true of life stories. I think people who share their life stories, and this is my second context that I'll come to very briefly, there are generational sorts of cliches or sayings or little phrases that people of the same generation or approximately the same experience nod. Yes, we recognize what that means. But for others who are not of that generational cohort, who did not go through that experience, doesn't mean very much. And I know I've warned my students in the field of literature very often, don't overread. Because when you overread, you read into. But if you read a body of material, such as these 200 disparate life stories that came in the last gathering, in the last campaign, then you begin to see some recurrences. As you read 200 stories, let's say approximately 2,000 pages, or a little bit more, a total, over the course of a month. That's a lot of reading. I don't give my students that much reading. But you begin to see certain kinds of textual correspondences, and then if you look at the scaffolding of the person's story or the people's stories, then you can begin to identify some of these paroles, or these units of code. And these, without some kind of explanation, will close. They will not be opened again. They'll be read askew, maybe in an interesting manner. So with those four, let's say, assumptions that I've come to question, and they continue to worry me as I collect stories, I come to the second modality that I've been closely involved with, and that is the life story workshop or the life story group. And this is a self-selective group of people. I started this in Toronto when I lived there, and I was, of course, worried about the the disappearance of older people's memories. And pensioners' wonderfully golden phrase, oh, someday I will write my autobiography, or I will write my life story. And that someday, when somebody says that who's 95, is a little bit different than if somebody is 70 when they're saying that, or 60. And so in order to facilitate, to support the process of writing, I also posted a call in the newspaper, and people came together in one of the community halls, and approximately 20 of them to begin with. They were curious about what I would teach them, and I was not going to teach them anything. I was going to say, here's a piece of paper, sit here for half an hour and start writing your life story. And then every week to begin to create a kind of cradle of dialogue around these emergent stories. And I thought for sure that, like a few people who came to the group in the beginning, they would stay in the group long enough to finish writing their text, whatever they imagined it to be, usually a kind of patchwork quilt first of small stories, and then beginning to put them together into something bigger. And I thought that, well, half-life maybe of 3 months. They'll come, they'll write because they're ready to write, or otherwise they wouldn't have come, and then they will leave the group. And the group as a whole stratified really among 3 subgroups generationally, that the group would not last very long. And 5 years after the group convened, other than the deaths of 3 people in the group, they were going strong. And they were writing. They wrote at home, came to the group, and read out loud for a short period, 8 to 10 minutes, something they had written the previous week, and then people talked about it. Not in the sense of critique, but in the sense of sharing, telling other stories that then emerged orally. And it was very interesting. I was facilitating the group as someone who had still the status of someone younger, someone who needed to be told about things, not someone who would spontaneously remember things that they were remembering. And then I left to move to Estonia, and not that I thought I had any magic role in the group, but I thought that it would slowly die down. Well, it didn't. It's still going strong, and the reason is pretty clear, and that is that if this kind of experiment works to catalyze people writing, then it also begins to be about sociality. It creates a framework for communicative memory to function, not across generations, so to speak, but among these subgroups. And the text, Freud said analysis is interminable. Well, in the same way, the process of generating stories, talking to each other, and then experiencing a kind of supportive sociality that older people really need. Some of them isolated, some of them living very far from each other, and not knowing each other from organizational context. This was what was interesting about the Toronto group. And so what keeps the group going is the shared experience of eldership, and people continue to find aspects of their past that they want to write about. There's another group that we started here at the Literature Museum in 2004. Dynamics are completely different. And interestingly enough, the sociality has been very slow in growing. And people didn't trust each other as much, and there was a great danger that the group would fall apart because of critical remarks or something much more trivial, the whispering that goes on at one end of the table as someone at the other end of the table is reading what they've written. And helping keep that in check has been difficult. So my surprise as a researcher, facilitator, that these groups keep on going is not so much a function of the harvesting of life stories through them as other phenomena that come out of the experience of being in a group for a long time, coming to care for one another, coming to call each other to make sure that the other one is still at the other end of the line. That network grew out of the Toronto group as well. And so this group, the Toronto group, very early on realized that in order to transmit their stories, they had to be translated, because even their children had trouble speaking, reading, and writing Estonian. And so there were a couple of older people in the original sample who wrote directly in English. Their English was halting sometimes. They would have been able to write more easily in their native language, but they were already crossing that threshold. And by now, the Toronto group has put out 3 volumes of translated stories. They have each found themselves a translator, sometimes a member of the family, and sometimes someone in the community who is adept at it. And so these stories exist in English. But life writing workshops, for all of their added benefits, are not an effective way of collecting life stories. If one talks about current scientific protocols of make it fast, make it effective, make it thorough, and move it on. It's a very slow process. And it's one that I believe in because I do really value this kind of frameworking of a communicative memory through it. So to come back to endings, because I'm not going to talk in the elegiac mode in the last couple minutes of my talk, but I think that the processes that one needs to be attentive of, not just in the practice of collecting life stories and publishing them, but also in looking at the place of life stories in any kind of national framework, any kind of larger framework. One is the not always articulated belief that we need to forget the sad stuff. Let's move on. Estonia doesn't need any refugee stories from 1944. Estonia doesn't need Siberian stories. We learned that in school. No more. We don't need to actively elicit this. I think that's wrong, but it is an understandable human moment. I already mentioned the kind of deep oblivion and unchartable oblivion of those who will never write for various reasons. And thirdly, the locking of codes, which I think careful research can help mitigate. But finally, fragmentation. And as I have a deep respect for Kogumelugu and other such projects that take clips out of interviews, my own schooling resists that tremendously. Because stories, life stories, need context, and I think they need to be connected in a meaningful way to a scaffolding. For one of my book projects, I worked with an Estonian family. Their children were about my age. And I interviewed these people who were second generation, and they remembered the emotion of their parents talking about the flight from Estonia to Germany in 1944. They remembered the emotion, but they didn't know which war it was. And they didn't know, let alone the fact of where and when. So now, scrolling forward 15 years, I find it really somewhat iffy to remain with only a fragmentary modality of representing and passing on life stories. I think that is not in itself adequate, which as iffy as it is to talk about projects like Estonian Life Stories, huge book, we were mailing them out to people who had contributed to the volume, 2.2 kilos. Think about, if you do transatlantic travel, how many kilos you have as your limit. So 2.2 kilos of one book is quite a lot to have to carry across the waves. Fortunately, we were able to complete that process with the institutional funding. Last but not least, I want to come back to kind of a hopeful message. And it's a question I've asked myself repeatedly. And it's a question about the people in a community who live the longest, the impact of longevity, those who are very old and who are still here to talk about their experience. And I've worked with one such person in Toronto, and she is 96 at the moment. And I find both the sense of proportion and the kind of tonality of her remembered life to be, in a way, a companion measure to the other stories that have been collected. And as long as she is able to remember, as long as I can work with her, I see that there's a real significance to looking at those who were longest lived or who have been longest lived in a community. And finally, on St. John's Day, on the 23rd of June, I was looking at the news online, and there was a little clip on the side, a broadcast of an interview by a choral conductor named Roman Toi, who just died at the age of 102 in Toronto. The interview was done with a member of the Estonian Broadcasting System, and it was filmed in 2014. And I knew Roman Toi, and I had, as a child, been in a choir that he directed and been in a song festival that he had directed, a very charismatic human being in every sense of the word. And he was allowed to talk at his own pace. There were not too many interview questions. But what he said was that for him, the most important thought that he carried with him every day when he was in exile was the will that the Estonian language not disappear. The sense of proportion that there are really only 1 million or less of people still knowing this language. And his passion was that that language not disappear. And even though I've learned to kind of turn a deaf ear to certain kinds of expatriate sorts of ideological slogans, then I couldn't help but be very moved by that vision, by that sense of he was a successful businessman. He had his day job, and he conducted choirs, and he was so involved in his non-working time in choral culture, and was able to enjoy coming back to Estonia and sharing the new period of song festivals. But this sense of carrying I wouldn't call it a mission, but simply a vision that this is worthwhile, making sure that a language doesn't cease to exist. And therefore, not scripting an ending means a willingness and an ability to carry on. And again, I think Roman Toi's interview is a good example of the impact of the longest lived, the longevity factor in any community. So I will stop there saying that processes of ending, forgetting, and oblivion need to be part of research on memory texts. And the imperatives of keeping materials safe, assuming people will transmit their legacy, and assuming that pictures and other materials are legible without any help, are imperatives that a researcher needs to examine. But the human value of life writing and the sort of behind-the-scenes process of making sure that some of the material becomes public is eminently worthwhile. And therefore, I hope that those who are working on that and similar topics don't think there's an inevitable ending to the process. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm Inno Salasoo, and in 1994 I published a book, 50 aastat vastu tahtmist välismaal, see ilmus Tallinnas. Ja minu teada see oli... Ei, okay, I can speak in English, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, in 1994 I published a book, 50 aastat vastu tahtmist välismaal, 50 years against will abroad. And to my knowledge, this was the first part biography published about that, about our, about the second half of the 20th century. And well, as a scientist, I know that whenever the scientific paper is compiled, it starts with a very brief, at least one sentence overview of what has been, what has appeared in that field before. Therefore, I was quite amazed that when you published the Rändlin to the Pesad, that it didn't mention that book of mine, which, as I said, I think was the first one of that kind.
Thank you for your comment. I have actually read your book, and the punch of the title is enough to, I think, pull the attention of any reader to the book and kind of compel reading it. The reason I didn't mention it in Rändlin to the Pesad, which was a collection of interviews with Estonians abroad, was because one of the interviewees was your son, and he didn't mention it. And so the collection of, this is not to say he should have, but the interview text was shortened and pulled together, but we didn't omit it. If it would have been there, the title of your book, it would have been included. But I think it's a very, very wonderful book, and the claim that for 50 years you were abroad against your will. 50 years is a long time to be anywhere, let alone against your will. So I do hope that in our future publications, we will acknowledge the fact that your book was as early as it was, and that it really did begin a kind of wave of stories. So thank you for the comment. And talk to your son about why he didn't mention it.
Any other? Anne?
As someone who does life writing of other people's stories and a bit of my own, but is even more reliant on an oral history methodology, I'm wondering why your emphasis on writing when for many people this requires literacy perhaps at a level that they feel uncertain about, especially in my case when it's my first language but the second or third or fourth language of the people I'm talking with. So I'd be interested to hear your take on the methodology of getting people to write as opposed to sitting down and talking with them with a microphone, and these days with a video camera too.
Thank you. That's a very important question. And I have actually worked with both modalities. And one of the reasons why I focused on the writing in Toronto was because there already was an established organization, a group of older people who were doing video interviews. And soliciting them. They had their own way of recruiting people to participate in the process. They had a method, and they also worked with making sure that the medium was savable and technically adequate. So I didn't want to interfere with that process. But what I watched as I was working with people who had a self-declared intention, they were interested in picking up whatever writing instrument. Most of them wrote by hand, which was very interesting in the age of the computer. But every now and then, a couple of the writers would reflect on the fact that they didn't have education to write. And one of them was an old fellow who was a blacksmith. He learned the trade of a blacksmith in Saaremaa, and he fled and continued working, and he worked in a foundry when he got to Canada. In the meantime, he did various kinds of odd jobs, but he had these other skills. And he came out of curiosity to this group, and he had occasion to write for a collection from his school. His trade school in Saaremaa had written to alumni already in the early 90s and said, could you please write what you can remember? Because they didn't have the modality of eliciting an oral history. So he had valiantly written a small account, but then he said, when he came to the group, he said, I haven't been to writing school. Ma ei ole kirjutamise koolis käinud. And that was a very interesting reflection, because indeed he had learned how to write an essay in school, but writing was not part of his practice of everyday life. He did not keep a diary. He did write letters to his family in Estonia and other family members scattered all over the world. But I think the answer to your question is indeed oral history is preferred by many people because they are a little bit afraid of getting started and facing this white page and not knowing whether what they're saying is quality. But the way to disarm it is very small assignments. Talk about a toy from your childhood. Take just a half an hour and write about that toy, even if it's 2 sentences. And then tomorrow, come back and read what you've written. Listen to it in your own head, and you may remember something else. Something else might come to mind. So there are various ways of helping people who already have the intent to work in that mode. But if people want to tell their stories orally, then I think they should be told orally. There's a little hazard in that if we transcribe the stories, as for one of my projects we did, these interviews I just mentioned related to Ino's son, we showed the transcript of the interview to the interviewees to correct, so that if there's anything they wanted to add or remove or whatever. And a couple of people were just absolutely flabbergasted by their text. They thought that it couldn't have been worse. How could I speak in such a rambling fashion? How could I have so many holes? How could I talk and hem and haw so much? And they were very alienated by this word-for-word transcript of what an oral historian really does, is with all of the pauses and with marking all the features of it. So that was another sort of interesting observation, so that it isn't necessarily, when it turns into a written text, something that the person wants to own. But I think both modalities, and sometimes in conjunction with each other. So thank you. That was a very good question.
Do we have one more question? No? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Aitäh, Tiina, and there are some thank yous I need to tell. There are lots of people actually I'd like to thank. First, I'd like to thank all the presenters who have come. We had guests from 11, even more countries. We got some more, not the presenters from 11 countries, but still quite a range of geography. So thank you so very much. I'd like to thank all the chairs who helped to keep this conference going. We have to thank all the supporters, and for the Baltic Heritage Network conferences and other events, it's usually Estonian Compatriots program, but this time also through the Estonian Literary Museum, our partner, we have some EU money used for the event. I'd like to thank all my colleagues in Estonia, our Välis-Eesti Arhiivide töörühm, our working group of Estonian archives abroad, and especially Karin, of course, who is our brilliant administrator. I'd like to thank the group of people who helped us to put together the thesis. Maria, thanks so much. Marin, wherever you are. Aino Lokk in Toronto, who did the proofreading. Both our great partners, the host institution, Estonian National Museum here, thank you for this amazing experience to stay here for 4 days in those brilliant and grandiose rooms. And the technical support, thank you, up there. Thank you to Literary Museum for different things you did for the conference, but especially for the last night at the museum and for the exhibit. I'd like also thank all the Baltic Heritage Network people all around the world who followed us via the internet, because that was the first time we had a live streaming of our event, and we got some feedback from all over the world already, so it seems that we have to continue the way we started this year. And then, discussing with our board, we decided that next time we go with a conference, with the Baltic Heritage Network conference to Lithuania, Vilnius. Yay! It will happen in 3 years, which means that would be 2021. But before that, all the Estonians are very welcome to come to our summer schools, and next year we have to find the time for the summer school in the framework of the Global ESTA Festival, both in Tartu and Tallinn, end of June. And a suggestion for those who doesn't leave right away, Tartu. Today we are celebrating Tartu City Day. So there's a huge culture program started already in a city center, but maybe for you as a people connected to memory institutions and libraries especially, there is a big book fair on Kühni Street, which is like a city center. You will find it if you start walking to the Town Hall Square. But there are also some concerts mostly dedicated to the opera music. So find out where they are and join the events. And that's it. Many thanks to all of you. I don't have a birthday.
So, but in the very, very end, let's make a huge applause to Piret and to Karin as the main organizers and the souls of Baltic Heritage Network.